Okay, in this video, what we're going to do is take a look at the channel box and the layer editor. Now, when you first start Maya, they're located on the right-hand side of your viewport. So this is your channel box right here, and down below is your layer editor. Now, above both of these, you'll notice that we have a toolbar. And the toolbar is going to provide some options for what we see on the right-hand side, and then some options for how the channel box is going to work. But before we start talking about this, let's first briefly discuss what the channel box does for you and what the layer editor does.
Okay.
The channel box is a place where you're going to view all keyable attributes for a selected object. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, what is an attribute? Well, all objects that you create inside of Maya have attributes. All objects in the real world have attributes. Example, let's say you have a hat in the real world.
Okay.
This hat is comprised of a series of attributes. These attributes include things such as its color, its size, its weight, etc.
Sure.
Okay? So when we start dealing with objects inside our scene, there's attributes for those objects as well. Now, the objects that are keyable, the ones that are set up to be animated easily, will view over here in your channel box.
Okay, cool.
Attributes that are set up not to be easily animated, they're non-keyable, will not show up over here.
Okay, that makes sense.
That does not mean that that object does not have any more attributes than what's seen over on the right-hand side. They're simply flagged as non-keyable.
Okay.
And we'll get more into that a little bit later. The layer editor provides a way of creating layers, very similar to Photoshop for any of you that have ever worked inside of Photoshop before. And with layers, basically, you can organize your objects so that you can control visibility, you can control if they're selectable or not, you can quickly select them, etc. And this becomes a wonderful utility when you start dealing with tons, possibly even hundreds of different objects in a scene.
Absolutely.
Okay, so with that, now that we kind of have a quick idea of what the two do, let's look just a little bit closer. I'm not going to go too in depth for for the simple fact that these videos and this particular lesson is all about an overview of the UI.
Well, also many of the things that we're showing in this this entire lesson involving the UI, the students are going to get a lot deeper into as they start working with
That's
them.
for sure. All right, so let's go ahead and start up here on our little toolbar. First of all, this icon right here is going to control these three icons. They're going to control what we see on the right-hand side. Like if I want to see just the channel box, there's just the channel box. If I'm working with just the layer editor, there's just the layer editor. And by default, you're going to see both, with the channel box being on top and the layer editor being on the bottom. You also have a splitter bar where you can control exactly how much of one or the other you see. Also, at the very bottom of both of these, you'll notice that we have these two buttons, one with arrows pointing to the left and one with them pointing to the right, where we can control expanding further out the channel box and layer editor or contracting them like such. So it all depends on how much real estate space you have. In other words, what resolution you're running Maya at.
Sure.
Now, let's go ahead and create an object in the scene so that we can see our channel box spring to life.
All right.
So let's go ahead and select an object or create an object. So I'll simply hit our polygon sphere. So there's the sphere. It is selected. And with the object selected, you'll notice that my channel box has come to life.
Very cool.
So I'm going to grab my splitter bar here, drag it down just a little bit so that we can kind of focus on what's going on. Now, look at all these attributes.
Wow.
Now, what we're looking at is attributes that are keyable for a selected node. Now, right now, the node that is selected is pSphere1. This is our pSphere1. It's the name of the object. Now, objects are comprised of multiple nodes, about 99.9% of the time inside of Maya.
Okay.
And we're going to talk about this a little bit later because we get into construction history and connections, etc.
We have an entire lesson dedicated to just how nodes work in Maya.
Absolutely. But this object right here, it's comprised of a few very important nodes. It has an input node, and the input node serves as kind of a set of blueprints, which determines like what the radius will be, how much detail will be in the sphere, etc. Then that information is sent over to another node, which is the shape node, and this node is the actual construction, it's the actual geometry that we see on the screen right here. And then from there, it's then sent over to be colored in case we were to view this in a shaded view, and in the end, there is a transform node that governs where the object is going to be in the scene. And inside of Maya, when we select objects, and when I say select, here's what I mean. I have deselected. I'm going to click on it. This object is now selected. When we select objects, we're generally selecting the transform node. And this is the transform node that we're seeing up here with all of its keyable attributes being displayed to us. So this is the transform node's name, pSphere1, and we can just say this is simply the name of our object. And these are the attributes that are relevant to a transform node, such things as translate X, Y, and Z. In other words, where does this object exist in the world? Its rotation, in 3D space, its scale in 3D space, and if it is visible or not.
Okay.
And by directly changing any of these things, like if I was to come over here and type in 5 and hit enter, you'll notice that I get feedback in my view panel, the object moving 5 units up in Y. Now, traveling on down, you'll notice we've got this divider line right here, and yet another divider line right here.
Okay.
Well, that's because we're viewing multiple nodes for this object. We only have one node opened up right now with its keyable attributes being shown to us, and that's the transform node. But we also have a shape node, and then we also have an input node. Now, we may have multiple shape nodes, or we could have multiple input nodes, given the situation.
Sure.
Right now, this is just a very simple sphere that we've created. If I was to click on the shape node, you'll notice that I can change the node's name, but there is no keyable attributes for it,
Right.
so we see no additional attributes down here. Now I'm going to come down here and click on Polysphere 1. This is the input node that I was talking about a second ago. And look at that. I do have access to attributes that control the makeup of this sphere. So if I wanted a radius of, let's say, 2, I could simply type 2 and hit enter.
And the sphere gets bigger.
That's right. And then the subdivisions axes for axes and height for the sphere can be adjusted here, allowing me to control how much detail the sphere is going to have. You notice now there's a lot less detail.
Sure. Very cool.
Again, since we're dealing directly with attributes, we've got to keep in mind, this does not mean this is all of the attributes for this given object. This is not a sidetrack here. I just want to point something out. So P-Sphere 1, keep that in mind. I'm going to come up here to Window. I'm going to open up the Attribute Editor. And it is inside the Attribute Editor where we see all of the attributes for this object. Check this out. P-Sphere 1, P-Sphere Shape 1, and then our input node. So there are the 3 nodes that we were just visualizing in the channel box itself. But look at the difference here, Zach. We've got
a lot more detail.
These
lots
are
more things.
All attributes. Okay, I mean there's a lot of attributes. Remember the shape node. The shape node had no attributes that we were able to see in the channel box, but yet coming into the attribute editor, where we can see all attributes, there are a ton of attributes available. The bottom line is they simply are not keyable. So I'm going to come up here and click on this icon right here on the status line, which will quickly switch me back over to my channel box so that now we're seeing a much more focused view of attributes. So hopefully you guys that are watching this video will see right away, well, wow, this is going to become quite important.
Absolutely.
First of all, that attribute editor, it was big. It gets in the way while you're working. Now, of course, it's going to become important. You're going to have to use it when you start dealing with attributes that are not keyable.
Sure.
But you're going to find yourself working with the channel box a lot.
Absolutely. You're typically, or at least I know, just speaking for myself, you're going to find yourself digging into the attribute editor when you have to access lower level things. And a lot of the common stuff is going to be right here in the channel box all the time and a lot easier to access and see immediate feedback in your viewport.
That's right. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring our attention, now that we've talked a little bit more about what we're seeing in the channel box, and we've talked about these icons here as for what we're seeing, let's go ahead and move our attention over to these 3 buttons on the right-hand side of the toolbar. First of all, manipulators. Okie dokie. What's a manipulator? A manipulator is a visual icon that is seen in your view panel that allows you to visually interact with an object's properties or attributes. Example, I'm going to move all the way over here to the left-hand side in my toolbox and select the Move tool, and we get these little arrows right here.
Okay.
We can click on an arrow and we can drag, and as we're dragging this arrow, you'll notice that I have information updating in my channel box.
Right, so you're changing the value of your current Translate X attribute by dragging the manipulator.
So let's say we want to move this guy down in Translate Y. So I'll click and drag down, and you'll notice that my Translate Y is updating interactively.
Cool.
Okay. Now, so what does that have to do with these icons up here? Well, now that we have an idea of what a manipulator is, this button up here showing the little, in fact, in this case, it's the Move tool that it's showing, in color means that this is the standard manipulator setting for Maya. And it means that any time you click on any attribute that has a manipulator for it, that manipulator will become visible in our view panel. For example, I'm going to go back to my regular select tool where this time I can't move the object. Now watch this. I'll come into my channel box, and the moment I click on one of these attributes, let's click on, let's say Translate X. Click. I instantly get a manipulator down here.
Nice.
And the Translate X stem, in this particular case, is selected.
Right,
so
it's usually red, so now it's yellow.
That's right, so I can just go ahead and slide it over. So backing up what Zach just said, we see that Translate Z is currently blue, yet if I click on it, it's now yellow, highlight it, and ready to be used.
Also notice over on the left-hand side in your toolbox, not to jump ahead, that the Move tool isn't currently selected.
That's correct. It's just whatever you click on, bink in here.
Nice.
So I go ahead and click on Rotate Y. Well, there is a manipulator for Rotate Y, and we can now see it. Scale, there we go. Same thing. Visibility. There is nothing for visibility.
Right.
So there you go.
It's either on or off.
That's right. And not that this is trying to get away from things, but I'm going to quickly make an attribute. Don't worry about how I'm doing this. And I'm going to call it example. That sounds good. So let's add it. So now I've added a custom attribute into my channel box. If I click on it, nothing happens there either.
Right.
You're going to see in just a minute where this is going to become kind of important. All right, so that's how the standard manipulator mode works.
Okay.
Now, if I click on this again, look at this. We have a little red X over our manipulator. This says no manipulators. When I select an attribute, I do not want to see a manipulator. Translate Y. Bink. No manipulator. Rotates. No manipulator. In fact, if you look over here, you'll notice our select tool stays selected, as opposed to a minute ago when these guys just all cleared out when I was seeing the manipulators caused by the selection of attributes over here.
Right.
So as we go down, nothing whatsoever. Simple enough?
Easy.
Now let's go ahead and change it one more time. This is invisible manipulators. And invisible manipulators actually unlocks the two buttons to the right on the toolbar.
Okay.
And let's get into these in just a second. Let me go ahead and introduce you guys to virtual sliding and show you what it does.
All right.
So what is virtual sliding? So let me go ahead and jump back real quick into a standard manipulator mode. Now keep the invisible one in mind because it's going to become very relevant in just a second.
All right.
Watch this. Translate Y. I can click and move this guy up and down.
Sure.
If I click right here and try to move up and down,
you get nothing.
That's like a marquee select. I let go and I've deselected my object. Let's select it again. A virtual slider is a slider that will allow you to change the value of that attribute virtually. Okay. Example, if I middle click on my mouse, now with the mouse button middle clicked, take a look at what manipulator is visible. Just translate Y. And if I move up and down, I no longer have to be on top of it over there. Now, if I move left and right, since this actually corresponds to the 3D view in regards to translate Y, it needs to be up and down. Left and right's not going to cut it. So if I was to say translate Z and select that, now I can move in my Z direction, and it works just fine.
So it's sort of a way to freely drag in the viewport and not have to get right on your object.
That's right. But where this becomes very important is when you have custom attributes down here. And with custom attributes, of course, there is no visual manipulator to deal with.
Nothing to reference.
So now I can, if I want to slowly adjust this number between 0 and 10, how am I going to do it? Well, I could come in here and type. Kind of a pain.
Yeah, what if you want to drag it smoothly between like 0 and 2 so you can go through all your values like 0.2, 0.57, and things like that?
Precisely. I simply select it, middle click, and check out my mouse icon. It's now a set of arrows. And as I drag it to the right and back to the left, you'll notice that my numbers are now interactively updating in the example custom attribute.
And this is called the virtual slider.
That is right. It's just middle click, drag, and that's it from inside your viewport.
Cool.
Let's go ahead and set this guy back to 0. Another thing, before I switch back over to invisible manipulator, since I just typed in the number 0, you can change the value of multiple attributes at one time. So if I wanted my scale X, Y, and Z to all be 2, I don't have to necessarily go click, 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 enter. I could do it all at the same time.
Okay.
Let's say I want to set it back to 1 now. I can click with the left mouse button, drag, let go, type in the number I want. So you'll notice that I have 2 more that are highlighted black at the moment. As soon as I hit enter, all 3 have been set.
Very cool.
So if I want to place all of these guys back at 0, I could simply select all 3, and I could select everything. I mean, it doesn't matter. 0, enter, and there I am. I've reset everything.
Nice.
Okay? You can also use Shift to your advantage by simply Shift-clicking to grab a continuous row of attributes, and you can also Control-click as well if you need a staggered selection. So keep that in mind when you need to set attributes. It's very quick. It's very handy. Now, let's move back over here to invisible manipulators. Now that we kind of have an understanding of how virtual sliders work, because this is going to become very important. With our invisible manipulators, if I click on Translate Y, I don't see a manipulator over here, yet if I click, or middle click, and drag left and right, look at that, up and down. Now, I don't move up and down with it like I did a minute ago when I had the manipulator.
As the icon on the viewport suggests, you have to slide left and right.
That's right. So now it is invisible, but we still have this ability. So I can move this up a little bit, and then move it over to the right a little bit, and then move it maybe a little bit towards us, like such.
Basically, invisible manipulators means you're relying solely on your virtual sliders.
That's correct. So that's how that works. Let's go ahead and zero this back out quickly. Come down here to example. Now, take a look at this. See how fast my numbers are jumping from 0 all the way up to 10?
Yeah.
Over just, what, about an inch on the screen? This may become a bit of a pain. What if you're dealing with a number that just goes from 0 to 1? That means you'd barely move your mouse a little bit, and boom, you're already at 1.
Right.
This is where we come over to the second button on the toolbar, to the right of our little invisible thing right here. This controls how fast the virtual sliding is going to affect our attribute value. Basically, it's a mapping of the distance moved of the mouse to the attribute value in the attribute.
Kind of like controlling the sensitivity of your virtual slider.
It really is. So right now we've got this guy set to medium. Bink. Now we're set to fast, to high. Look at that. So now I move it an inch, and we're way up here at 100. Let's go ahead and set that back down to 0. Click it again. Now we're at small. Okay, so now it's just a very fine or slow, very fine movement. So let's come over here, click, and drag. Look at that. Now it's decimal movements. And for me to get all the way up to 10, I'm going to have to move
several times,
very long ways.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
This could be very handy. Now, I have one more thing I want to show you, and then I'll wrap it up, and that will move us out of the channel box. Or a couple more things. Just slide a few more. All right, so here we go. Moving from this guy over to the right, this guy is going to control how the value is going to update based off of the mouse movement. You have two different settings here. You have linear and hyperbolic. At the moment, we're on linear, which means if I middle-click with my virtual slider and I drag left or right, my value will change linearly.
Go ahead and pick on a translate value so they can see the sphere moving the viewport.
That's good. So we'll do X. So we'll move it away, we'll move it back. So it's kind of slow. Let's go and put this back to medium right there. So away, back, away. So, but it's a linear movement.
So your sphere is moving at a constant rate in time with the mouse.
That is correct. If I was to come up here and change this to hyperbolic, now what happens is I get a very fine movement at first, but then as you'll notice with the little curve right here, it's going to quickly start to speed up. For instance, so as I start dragging it toward me, look at that. Slow, 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 slow. Now, I'm not changing how fast I move my mouse, yet the sphere, woo.
That relationship is changing over time.
That's right.
Or actually changing over distance.
Yeah, that's a better way. Yeah, for a second I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah, that doesn't work. It's
so here
changing over distance
I'm going
as you drag the mouse.
I'm going to start my mouse over here at the border of the viewport just as a reference. And let's watch how far this guy moves. So middle click, here we go. So as I'm dragging, I'm going to keep my rate as constant as I possibly can. And you'll notice that the sphere is barely moving, but watch this. The sphere is about to start picking up faster, and is gone.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is this handy for? This is handy for a couple of things. One, if you don't want to change your, the ability for you to move at a fast rate to a very fine rate. Let's say you need to make some very fine adjustments.
Right.
But then you need to jump back to an object whose attribute needs to be adjusted over a great distance.
Sure.
This kind of gives you the best of both worlds.
It keeps you from having to switch back and forth between your slider speeds a lot.
That's correct. So one final thing I want to point out. Let's say we set this back to slow, and this guy's over here left on hyperbolic, and I go back to standard manipulators. Check this out. The settings are maintained, and it still functions exactly as expected over here, with the exception of now I'm going to see my manipulator. Okay?
Gotcha. Very cool.
So let's go ahead and set this back to default. There we go, and boom.
Nice.
So just something to keep in mind. So a couple more things real quick. We do have a menu bar for our channel box. The menu bar is going to show you a bunch of different things that you can do with selected attributes.
Yeah, mostly related to attributes and animation.
That's right. Key a selected attribute, key all attributes that are visible, breakdowns, mute attributes, cut, copy, paste attributes, hide and unhide. You can do expressions. I mean, there's all sorts of different things that you can do. The Objects menu is going to show you a list of the objects that are currently selected. Right now, I only have one object selected. Simple enough. Let's go ahead and move this guy out of the way and show you why this can be helpful. Now, often inside of Maya, you're going to need to... Oops, let's not do that. Let's just move this guy over. There we go. Often inside of Maya, you're going to need to select objects in a very specific order due to the tool that you're going to use.
Sure.
It's going to require a specific selection
order is going to become very important as we work.
And generally, it's what object is last.
Right.
And here's an example. So let's say that my cone is going to be the last object selected. So I first select this guy. I'm going to hold Shift down on the keyboard. I'm now going to select my sphere. Then I'm going to select my cone.
So your order was cube, sphere, cone.
Now, if I come up here to Objects and go all the way to the bottom, Cube, Sphere, and the first one presented inside our little menu there is the last object selected. And you always have this divider line right here that's going to divide your last object from your other objects. But your list, your selection list, order is main.
And this is going to become very important. Yeah, it's going to become super important when we start working with hierarchies and constraints.
That's correct. So there you go. And of course, the little selection or these little option boxes over here are simply going to open up the attribute editor with this given object or whatever object you selected it for, already loaded.
Cool.
Okay, so that's a very quick look at the channel box and how it works. And also, one final thing. You have
squeeze one more thing.
That's
in.
right. One more quickie. You have seen that I can select attributes or multiple attributes. I can also right-click and get that same menu by doing that.
Cool.
Now, moving on down to the layer editor, we're going to talk about this very, very briefly because we're going to be using it a lot later, and at that time we'll get to focus on the different settings a lot more.
Sure.
But the layer editor works in two different ways. Right. Well, the layer editor works in two different sets of layers.
Okay.
That's a better way to put it.
Yeah.
It is a way of creating layers that allow you to organize things. The two different sets of layers that you can have are display and render. The display is for while you're working in your 3D scene. You want to organize things for selection purposes, for the ability to hide things, etc. That's display. When you want to start working with things in regards to setting up how things are going to render out, then you start working with render layers. And we'll focus on that a little bit more later. For now, let's just take a quick look at display layers. So I want to come in here and create one more object. Let's do a NURBS sphere this time. So we have two different types of spheres. And I'm going to take this guy right here, come back down to my channel box to my input node, set its radius back to 1, just so that everybody's about the same size. Let's zoom in a little bit. Now, check this out. I'm going to create a new layer. Dink, I've created a layer. And I'm going to change this layer's name. So I'll double click on it, and this is going to open up the Edit Layer dialog. From inside here, I'm going to call this Sphere Objects. Now, we have a few settings in here. And these settings outside of the name are all available back over here in these three little depressed boxes, if you will. Now, and you'll see this for all three layers. They're just kind of quick shortcuts to these various features.
Sure, toggles, if you will.
That's right. The first one where we have a V here, that is everything that's in this layer visible or not visible? And we can preset it ahead of time by simply unchecking this right here. The next box is going to be the display type. Is it visible? Is it templated? Or is it referenced? And I'll show you the difference between these in just a second, so let's leave it at normal. And then the final thing, which is this box over here, is the color. Default wiring, or are we going to set a color for the wireframed object?
Yeah, just to reiterate, that's only changing the color of the wireframe. When you look at it in shaded, you won't see any difference.
That's right. So let's go ahead and select red, because that's going to just stand out and smack
really
you.
stand out, yeah.
So let's go ahead and save this. Now, let's go ahead and take the space out of here, or put an underscore, because you cannot have spaces in your names.
Right.
So let's go ahead and save that. So here we are, Sphere Objects. It is red, and it is visible. What is currently inside this layer? Nothing. Let's put a couple things in there. I'm going to select my two spheres by doing a marquee selection, right-click on this layer, and there's all sorts of things I can do in here, right? But I'm going to come down here to the most important one in this particular case, which is Add Selected Objects. Now, the moment I do this, I want you guys to watch something else. Let's drag our channel box down just a little bit. As a quick reminder, the Shapes section and the Inputs section both contain only one node each.
Okay.
Watch what happens to our Inputs section. Right-click, Add Selected Objects, boom. Ooh, Sphere underscore Objects now appears in my Inputs list for each of these guys. I'll select this one, Sphere underscore Objects. I'll select this one, Sphere underscore Objects.
Very cool.
So now that's playing a part in the whole node network that's being generated behind the scene.
Sure, there's a connection between the objects and the layer object itself.
That's correct. Now watch this. Let's go ahead and deselect my spheres. What color are they?
They're nice and red.
They're nice and red. Now I'm going to hit 5 on the keyboard to switch over to a shaded view in the viewport. Bink. And look at this. They're no longer red.
Right.
And that goes away.
Because we're only changing the color of the wireframe.
Again, I'm sorry?
I was going to say the color of the shaded view is actually dependent on what material you have applied to the object, which is something we'll talk about later.
That's right. So let's go ahead and hit 4 to switch back into a wireframe. Now, color coding your wireframes can be extremely helpful when you're dealing with tons of objects in the scene.
Well, let's just say, for example, you're animating a scene of this huge, awesome-looking ogre marching through a forest.
Okay.
But you need a way to get the trees out of your scene because they're slowing down your viewport, or you need to be able to tell one kind of tree from another.
Okay.
So you can start color-coding things into these layers. Also, you can switch the visibility of your trees on and off as you work.
That's right. So exactly what you're saying. Let's say I want to hide all of my spheres in the layer. click. A good example is, let's say I'm working on a car engine, and I have all of my bolts put into a layer.
And they would all stack over each other, and you wouldn't be able to see
tons
anything.
of them. So I could quickly turn off all of the bolts just by turning off visibility. It doesn't mean they're gone. We've just simply hidden them. I can bring it back by simply clicking on the depressed button or the depressed box right there.
Which on complex scenes is really going to help you out if your viewport starts to bog down and starts moving really slowly.
That's right. Now, what does the box right next to it do? Well, that's pretty simple. This controls our display type. Standard is with nothing being shown inside the box right there, which means I can select these guys all day long. If I was to click one time, I'm going to see a T, which means we're now in a template display style.
Okay.
What does this mean? This means that I cannot select anything that's been templated. I cannot select anything that is inside that layer at this time.
Well, you can't select it through the viewport anyway.
That's correct. We can select it other ways, but I can't select it through the viewport. Now, if I switch over to a shaded mode, watch this. These two objects were shaded.
Right.
The two objects that were in the layer that's been templated were still left as a gray wireframe. Keep that in mind, because that is where our next mode comes in. Let's go and switch back into wireframe real quick. The next mode is referenced. Referenced is very similar to template in the fact that you cannot select the objects in the viewport as seen here. But if I switch over to a shaded mode by hitting 5 on my keyboard, they show as shaded. So at this point, you can't really tell who's referenced and who's not.
Exactly.
So this could become confusing for a beginner going, why can't I select this? But why is this important? Well, one, sometimes you need to see things shaded, but you don't want to accidentally select it. And number two, this is a little bit more advanced, and we'll be talking about it later, but you can snap objects to objects that have been referenced, while you cannot snap things to objects that have been templated.
Yeah, just remember we said that for later.
That's right, and that again becomes a bit more complex, but is very important.
And just a brief reminder, when you're working in your scene and you have been using layers and you've been referencing your objects, if at some moment you realize you can't select an object, remember I said in the status line video, whenever you can't select something, your eyes should go up to your pick masks first. The second place your eyes should go is down here to see if you've got anything referenced in your layers.
That is correct. Now, of course, we can make as many layers as we need to make for organizing things and controlling visibility. Final thing I want to show is, of course, we can right-click, and we see all the different things in here. I can also come down to select for selecting all of the objects, bink, that's in there. And that's very handy as well. There's other options available inside that menu, and we'll be covering these later videos. So with that, that's going to wrap up everything I want to talk about for now with the channel box and the layer editor. Thanks a lot, guys.